was bitten and little red marks appeared on his hands, and he didn't realise, and nobody would have told him in those days, that the red marks on his wrists were fatal and that in a short time he'd be dead.
It was not long before other deaths followed, and the villagers realized their fate. The plague had come to Eyam. The death toll began to soar.
Though, of course, there's no medical help in the village. There's no apothecary. There's no nursing assistance. The people were totally bewildered. And the only person, of course, who really they could turn to was their rector. And they called on him for help.
The village rector was William Montpesson. He saw at once that Eyam was doomed, but knew there was still a chance to prevent the plague from spreading to the neighboring towns. He ordered an immediate quarantine of the village. Nobody was allowed in or out, including himself.
And when they first heard this, the shock must have been terrible, because they would realise immediately that if they accepted quarantine, cut themselves off, if they didn't die of plague, they were likely to die of hunger. Now, this was solved by the Earl of Devonshire, of course, who lived in Chatsworth House, just a few miles away, and he agreed to supply as much food as it was possible.
The transaction became one of the most dramatic stories of the plague years. To avoid spreading the disease, the Earl had the food delivered to a desolate spot marked by a stone on the boundary of the village. In payment, the condemned villagers left what coins they had, washed in vinegar to kill any vermin.
And the irony of that is that, of course, that some of these poor devils that died with more food in their bellies than they'd ever had in so-called happier times.
The weeks passed, then months. It was assumed that everyone in Eyam would eventually succumb. September 1666, 1 year after the plague had descended upon Eyam, the first outsiders ventured into the village, expecting a ghost town. But to their amazement, not everyone had died. Those who lived told extraordinary tales of miraculous recovery that have passed into the folklore of the village. But the actual number of survivors has been lost to time. Joan Plant is a descendant of those survivors. She takes pride in her heritage and can recount stories that have been passed down through the generations. One tale tells of the village gravedigger, who in his haste to bury the dead, dragged a plague-stricken man from his sheets while he was still alive.
Presumably didn't know the difference between unconscious and dead, I don't know, but he dragged this chap down the stairs, and halfway down the stairs this bloke revived. And when he got to the bottom, asked for a drink, and supposedly, you know, he was okay and he survives.
Even more notorious was the case of Joan's ancestor Margaret Blackwell. In the final stages of the disease, Margaret staggered to the kitchen, overcome by desperate thirst, just hours after she had been left for dead by her brother Francis.
She was quite delirious and didn't know where she was. Saw this milk jug on the table and just drank this, what she thought was milk, and it was fat, bacon fat. And she survived the plague. She was a survivor, and so that's quite a tale in itself, in that maybe the bacon fat cured her. I don't know, but that's one of the stories.
Whether fact or fiction, the tales indicate that for whatever reason, some people had survived. But for historian John Clifford, the real question was just how many.
So we put it to the test, and we analysed the parish register, which starts in 1630, and we listed everybody who appeared to be alive in 1665. We deleted those who died in the plague, and then we searched the register for evidence of survivors. And we went as far as 1725, which was 60 years after the plague, and we found evidence of people marrying, people having further issue or of dying. And we picked out 433 survivors.
Records show that not only did many people recover, some did not get sick at all, despite being in constant contact with the bacteria and the victims. One such case was Elizabeth Hancock. The Hancocks lived on the edge of the village and had managed to escape the infection for some months. Then, in August 1666, the telltale boils appeared on John, the youngest Hancock boy. Within days, his sister Alice was stricken with the disease. Their mother nursed them, to no avail. One by one, Elizabeth dragged her children's bodies to a burial spot on the hill behind their home. In total, she buried 6 of her children and her husband in the space of 1 week. The graves are still on the hillside outside Eyam. Yet in spite of daily contact with her infected family, there is no record that Elizabeth ever became ill.
One of the things that is very common about studying infectious disease in large populations is that different people have different outcomes. Not everybody gets sick or not everybody dies, and every disease is a little bit different. And the explanation for that is often assumed to be nutrition or environment or native immunity. But today we're beginning to discover that more and more of the differences in response, particularly to infectious disease, has to do with the genes the individuals carry around with them. And those genes have been sculpted really by their own ancestral history and the things that have come up in the past with respect to their ancestors. Because the people that are around today are offspring of individuals who've been exposed to many infectious diseases in the past and who've survived, as opposed to the ones who died who didn't leave offspring.
O'Brien theorized that the survivors of Eyam might have been protected by their genetic makeup. If this was the case, their protective genes would have been passed down to their offspring. Many of the plague survivors and their descendants lie buried in the Eyam graveyard, indicating that families have stayed in the town through the generations. The Hancocks, the Furnaces, the Blackwells. Joan Plant can track her family all the way back to the townspeople who managed to live through the horrible epidemic.
Sort of meet some of you folks.
My maiden name is Harling, and my mum's name was Furnace. So my ancestors are Furnace family, and they're just over here. This is one of my ancestors.
These are your great-grandparents here.
That's right. There's the Hancock grave, Elizabeth Hancock and her husband Albert. And here are my direct ancestors, George Furnace and his wife Emma. And I am a descendant of the Furnace family. My mum was a Furnace and my grandparents. So, yeah, both of these are my family graves.
The Eyam population is a fascinating opportunity to look at really what is a natural history experiment to understand the interaction between plague and genetic resistance. Virtually everyone was exposed to the plague bacillus, and a very high fraction of them died as a consequence. The few survivors that emerged afterwards intermarried and left a legacy, if you will, of descendants, and by looking at their genes, we're wondering whether we can discover the gene that caused resistance to that plague.
The large number of descendants still living in Eyam was a gold mine for O'Brien. But in order to put his genetic theory to the test, he would have to persuade the villagers to take part in an extraordinary experiment.
And the children.
They're all children,
Yeah.
He would need to analyze their genetic makeup to see if he could find a particular mutation that provided protection from the plague bacteria. If such a mutation were present, it would stop the bacteria from infecting the body by preventing them from acting on the cells the way they were supposed to. Rick Titball explains.
We know that for many microorganisms which cause disease, there's a very specific interaction between the microorganism and